Welcome dear learners. Today we are going to see about one act play. I am Pratima Shri, Assistant Professor, Department of English. The topic is A Mother's Day, written by J.B. Priestley. Now we can see about J.B. Priestley. He was an English novelist, playwright, screenwriter, broadcaster, and social commentator. He was born on 13th September 1894 at Manningham, Bradford, UK. He served in the infantry in the First World War and then studied English literature at Trinity College, Cambridge. In most of his novels, his Yorkshire background is reflected. His important plays are An Inspector Calls, Time and the Conways, and Dangerous Corner. His other notable works are Angel Pavement and The Good Companions. He received Noel Coward Award for his comedy play. He breathed his last on 14th August 1984 at Stratford upon Avon, UK. Introduction to the play. Mother's Day is a play by J.B. Priestley. It is a satirical and humorous depiction of the status of women. It deals particularly with the housewives who suffer a lot for their families. A housewife dedicates all her time to serve for her family members. In this story, Mrs. Annie Pearson tells her problems caused by her family members to her neighbor, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is a fortune teller and magician. Mrs. Fitzgerald advises her to exchange their personalities. Through Mrs. Fitzgerald's magic power, both of them have exchanged their personalities. Mrs. Annie Pearson's character is within Mrs. Fitzgerald, and Mrs. Fitzgerald's character is within Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is now in the form of Mrs. Pearson, controls her family members and teaches them a good lesson. Soon after the incident, they switch over to their personalities again and come to their original self once again. Characters: Mrs. Annie Pearson, George Pearson, Doris Pearson, Cyril Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Setting: the action takes place in the living room of the Pearsons' house in a London suburb. Time: the present. Scene: the living room of the Pearson family, afternoon. It is a comfortably furnished, much lived in room in a small suburban semi-detached villa. If necessary, only one door need to be used, but it is better with one uplift leading to the front door and the stairs and the other in the right wall leading to the kitchen and the back door. There can be a muslin covered window in a left wall and possibly one in the right wall too. The fireplace is assumed to be in the fourth wall. There is a settee up right, an armchair down left and one down. A small table with two chairs on either side of it stands at the center. Now we can see about summary. The Mother's Day is a humorous play written by J.B. Priestley. It portrays the status of mother in the family. The writer brings plight of the mother realistically in the play. Mrs. Annie Pearson dedicates her time and life for her family members. Nobody in her family understands her feelings. She is treated as a slave in her own house. Her husband, George Pearson, and her children, Doris and Cyril, always dictate her to fulfill their needs. Mrs. Annie Pearson works hard and her life changes when she meets Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is her neighbor. She is a fortune teller and knows magic also. She admits to Fitzgerald everything about her family behavior. Moreover, Fitzgerald recommends her to exchange her personality. It will enable her to teach a lesson for her family members who are rude to Mrs. Pearson. After getting her acceptance, Mrs. Fitzgerald casts a spell and swaps her personality with Mrs. Pearson. Immediately, Mrs. Pearson becomes very strong in her approach, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is sitting idle. Mrs. Pearson's daughter Doris enters and asks her mother to iron her dress. She refuses to iron the dress and asks her daughter to do the same. Similarly, she avoids to do the work given by her son and her husband. Finally, the family members have learnt a lesson and start supporting Mrs. Pearson in all aspects. Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson exchange their personalities once again and come to their own self. Now here assessment is given. You can answer the answers for these questions in a comment box. Thank you.